I have to say straight away that myself and colleagues don't understand why there is such a rapid move to end restrictions and indeed to send the message to the public that the virus does not need our collective attention anymore. For us, wisdom is about continuing to treat the virus as though it is quite dangerous and at the same time having a very clear message to everybody as to what is involved in dealing with it at this time.
Um, Obviously, so delighted to have you here. Let me just kick straight off. We know that the government's planned ambition is to end all restrictions, including the legal requirement to self-isolate after a positive COVID test, to end those restrictions by the end of this month, by February. Is that timing about right to your ears?
I have to say straight away that myself and colleagues don't understand why there is such a rapid move to end restrictions and indeed to send the message to the public that the virus does not need our collective attention anymore. For us, wisdom is about continuing to treat the virus as though it is quite dangerous and at the same time having a very clear message to everybody as to what is involved in dealing with it at this time. And that does mean continuing to prevent it from spreading from person to person, and then at the same time making sure that people who are infected with the virus do isolate and avoid infecting others. It's still dangerous, and the only solution we have to dealing with this virus is the efforts of people. And if messages to people are not very, very clear at this quite difficult time of hoping that the pandemic is receding, the last thing you want to do is to create openings for it to surge back again and cause further trouble.
So you disagree with people like Dr. Rupert Beale, who's head of cell biology at the Crick Institute, who said we're in a phase now where triple vaccinated people with normal immune systems can stop worrying from a personal point of view. You would disagree with that?
Well, I mean, I just want to say I know very little about this virus, and so do colleagues who are working on it. It's a new virus that emerged just over 2 years ago. The new variant that is now dominant emerged only at the end of November last year. And so I can't make predictions about what's going to happen with this virus with the kind of certainty that I'm hearing from others. And so that's why I am suggesting caution. I don't think anything is lost by people continuing until the levels of virus really drop down to much, much lower than they are now. I don't think there's anything's lost by people continuing wearing face masks and maintaining physical distance. It doesn't destroy the economy and it doesn't mess up people's social relations. It does create some inconvenience, but that, in our view, that inconvenience is worth it.
I completely understand where you say you don't think that social distancing or mask wearing costs anybody anything in terms of hours lost at school or hours or money to the economy. But of course, the self-isolation does cost. It does cost children time off at school. It does cost the economy money. So perhaps you can see why the government is eager to relax the rules on isolation.
Absolutely, I can see that totally. I suppose for me, the issue there is that this virus is dangerous. 1 in 20 people who get infected with it have long illness, what we call long COVID. It's not fully understood yet what the overall meaning of this long COVID is, but as more data become available, we do realize that some of the people with long COVID are likely to have subsequent issues with their hearts or issues with their breathing. This is not a trivial virus. That's our view. And we would like to urge people to treat it with the respect that we think it deserves. And that does mean isolating. You want to avoid other people getting infected from you. And staying out of the way is, for us at least, the most important way to do this.
So you wouldn't agree with those who say that actually that is reducing the general sort of herd immunity, and therefore actually given that this strain is less severe, that there might be a benefit in reducing isolation and increasing people's immune?
And that I've heard. There are people who say that letting the virus move around and infect others is in fact doing them a favour because it's helping them to have immunity, which in turn reduces their risk of further infection. It's like a kind of natural immunisation process. And I'd be fine about that if somebody could tell me that being infected with the virus really is not potentially dangerous. That's my concern. It's doing an experiment really on the population if you say let the virus move around and infect whoever it needs to. And what I don't really think that we know enough about this virus to be that that easy about the possibility of more and more people being infected and almost making it a deliberate strategy. It's called herd immunity, and I've never heard of a disease that's as new as this one being tackled through an intentional approach to herd immunity. So I would stick with my view that first of all we need to try to avoid spreading the disease, and secondly, if we've got the disease, we need to keep out of the way, because that is the priority from me as a public health person. I quite understand that this is a challenge for businesses, a challenge for the health service, but I cannot at this stage see that as being justified, the ending of self-isolation.
So, Professor, it sounds like you would wholeheartedly agree with the Royal College of Nursing, who have called it a leap in the dark. But it does make people like myself wonder, if not now, then when? What is the box that needs to be ticked for us to take this next, or for you to be comfortable with the government taking this next step? Because deaths are down, cases are down, hospitalizations are down. In fact, average mortality is, even including COVID at the moment, is lower than it normally would be. So if not now, when?
So here's the problem for somebody like me. I'm a specialist in public health. My business is to focus on how to minimize the suffering of populations, and I tend to focus on all the population, and so my focus is actually on the world and not on any specific country. And my advice is always going to be influenced by this focus. Now, there will be others, and they will be people running countries, who will say that they have to make a balanced judgment between the health of the public and the well-being of the nation. And there comes the rub. You have to titrate one against the other. I heard you saying your own perspective is one of really favouring perhaps a loosening of restrictions. I get that. And what I want to say now is that what my input to this has to be an input to an argument, and I accept that I might lose the argument, but I have to keep stating my case, which is this is a new virus, and it does have long-term effects, and those are affecting younger people. And I just think that in the circumstances, I think it's really rather dangerous to be moving down this path. The Royal College of Nursing saying it's a leap in the dark, that seems to me quite a good way of describing it. For me, it's a gamble. And I would just say to everybody, is this gamble really worth it? Or is it one that perhaps is just going a bit too far?
And I suppose when we're trying to quantify or think about what is worth it and what isn't worth it, we're dealing with so many unknowns, because we know that mental health has suffered. We know that domestic abuse and other abuses have suffered, but we don't have the full picture yet, and probably won't have the full picture of the downside of caution for a very long time.
Well, I think that this really exposes the core issue. If we're going to be cautious, like I am advising, we need to be cautious with at the same time being smart. And so, yes, mental health is suffering hugely. Yes, as you've just said, we get reports of increased domestic violence and abuse in places where people are confined. I'm not arguing for widespread confinement. I'm saying that people who've got the disease and know they've got the disease ought to be isolating. I'm saying that people who have possibility that they're going to expose others to the disease have to wear face masks and ought to maintain physical distancing. But I'm not advocating absolute lockdown in the face of this virus. At the current levels of transmission, I'm suggesting that there is caution to reduce spread. I'm suggesting that people who have the disease try not to infect others. But I'm really against the kind of lockdown approaches that are often used, certainly as a primary means of controlling the disease. And I think 2 years into the pandemic, we know much more about how to reduce spread than simply just stopping all movements.
Let me ask you about testing, because this is another element to what we are expecting the government to say, which is to dramatically reduce the availability of free testing. And again, 300 senior NHS leaders polled by the NHS Confederation, 8 out of 10 of those are very much opposed to the ending of free lateral flow tests. And yet the government has to balance the cost to the Treasury is huge. But my concern is if we do cut back on testing, and if the rumours are true that the ONS COVID survey, which I don't need to tell you, but just to remind listeners, gives us an idea of how many people in the community have COVID by using randomised samples, also gives us an early warning sign if there are new variants or mutations. There are rumours that that might be being shut down. If that's the case and we lose the free lateral flows, how will we know what's going on? How will we know if there are mutations?
Well, that's excellent that you've raised this. Now, the virus is our adversary. People are the solution. That's the case with all infectious diseases. It's particularly the case for this one. And for people to be able to take responsibility, for example, to know when they do need to wear masks and so on, they need to know what this virus is doing to themselves and to their communities. And the more responsibility that is given to people to be leading their own response, the more necessary it is for them to be able to know where the virus is. How do you know where the virus is? Firstly, through surveillance by government, and that's where the ONS survey that you describe is important. It really is an excellent example of how you know what the virus is doing. Secondly, you need to know whether you are infectious, and that means being able to do a self-test on yourself. It's terribly important. So we would say that the most logical strategy, especially if you are trying to reduce restrictions on people, is to equip them with what they need to be able to make the best choices for themselves and therefore for their families and communities. And that means keeping access to testing. I can't, again, fully understand what the argument is, because for me, enabling people to access lateral flow tests, something that's gone really well in Britain, by the way, is surely a cost worthwhile when set against the potential impact of big resurgences of virus and, of course, of new variants, because we just don't know what's happening. I hope that rather long answer is okay, because I want this to kind of come across as clearly as I can get it.
Well, it does seem to me that the idea of shutting down the ONS survey seems completely bonkers. Financially, it's peanuts compared to the other costs of the pandemic. It seems like a very strange decision if that is going to be the case. I must move on though. I'd love to know, if you've lost the battle, if restrictions are being lifted, what would it take, do you think, for those restrictions to be reinstated? What would be the trigger for that?
This gets really difficult. One of the reasons why we are nervous about what we would see as premature removal of restrictions on what people do is that this will make it really hard for them to be reintroduced if the epidemiological situation is necessary. You're almost implying to the public that the most important requirement is, inverted commas, freedom to do what you want, close inverted commas, rather than activities that will maintain public health. It's kind of the nature of the partnership between state and people seems to be changing. And so I am considering that it's going to be quite hard for a government, if there is a sudden resurgence in cases, if there is perhaps a further mutation of the virus leading to it becoming more serious, it'll be hard for the government to reintroduce restrictions, especially if the justification for their removal appears to be a bit dubious in public health terms.
So it sounds to me like you're saying it'll be difficult to put the genie back in the bottle once these restrictions have been lifted. But I think to many people who are very, very keen and even anxious for these restrictions to be lifted, that is also what they fear, that they think that public health people like yourself want to keep the restrictions in place because they know it's going to be too difficult to reinstate them, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, no, I get that. And of course, these kinds of debates are not infrequent for those of us working in public health, and so much depends on whether or not governments are prepared to take decisions on behalf of their people that appear to be perhaps a little bit unpopular, but are for the good of all. And remember, you can't treat the United Kingdom as an island. The United Kingdom is a country which has led in public health for decades, and other nations and their peoples look to the UK for an example. This is a worldwide pandemic. It is affecting people in every corner of the world. And so it's not just important for Britain that the decisions in the coming days and weeks are the best ones. It's important for the whole world. I'm not actually, by the way, sort of saying that I want to keep restrictions because if they are removed, it'll be hard to reinstate them. I can understand that. My own view is that you do what you need to do given the nature of the threats that you face. And the advice that I'm giving with regard to maintaining at least a restriction on isolation of people who've got the virus is because I believe that is warranted for the situation we're in now.
And talking of the rest of the world, and I'm aware that we're running short on time now, but thinking about countries like Denmark, who've already lifted most restrictions, is there anything that we can learn from looking at their example?
Well, I was looking at the situation in Denmark as well, like you, and I think that there is a real issue in Western Europe at the moment, that leaders are looking at each other and saying, well, if one can take this decision, then others can take this decision. We can afford to run the risk that our health services are going to be further burdened. We can afford to run the risk that there's going to be more long COVID in our populations, but we've got to reduce restrictions because from the perspective of our economy and our societies, that's the right thing to do. I'm not personally certain that there's a lot to be learned from other countries in Europe right now. It looks like they're all going into the gamble at the same time. But I do want to keep looking at countries in other parts of the world. And my belief is still that maintaining a defense against this virus by preventing infection has enabled many countries in Asia and also countries in Africa when they've been able to introduce it, to have less virus in their societies, and less virus in their societies means less likelihood of mutation, less long COVID. So my position is that the lessons that I'm learning from around the world is continuing to treat this virus as a dangerous virus and act accordingly is the right thing to do.
Professor, of course, it stands to reason that the people most anxious about restrictions being lifted are in the UK, the roughly 1.4 million people so-called clinically extremely vulnerable. What should those people be doing now? And do you understand how so many of them feel rather abandoned?
I meet quite regularly with people who either are vulnerable or who are experiencing long COVID and trying to manage their lives with it. And there is a sense indeed of abandonment, but also a sense that they're just not being listened to. They're not being believed. There are numerous people who are in this situation who wonder why it is that their needs are not being taken seriously, especially because they are quite extreme. People who are immunocompromised just do not want to get exposed to this virus. I don't have any solution to this. My own view is that all governments need to pay attention to the needs of all their people and need to demonstrate constant humility because the virus is new and is changing, and at the same time extreme honesty, because the one thing that everybody needs everywhere in dealing with this virus is to be able to believe in their leaders, to perceive their leaders are authentic. There's a crisis of trust in leadership around COVID-19 right now.
Yes, I think that's certainly true. And I'm just going to squeeze in one last question, because it would be strange if I didn't ask you about vaccinations for over fives, which we know as of this week, the government is going to be introducing in a few weeks' time. Is that something you support when the numbers are so tiny of danger to that age group from COVID?
So obviously every country needs to be introducing its own vaccination policy. My own view is that the world should be adopting an approach on vaccination where it is prioritised for older people, people with diabetes and other illnesses that make them more susceptible to extreme COVID, and also people who are heavily exposed, like health workers. And I would have vaccination for children quite low down on my priority list. I mean, the only justification, as far as I can see, is that you're preventing long COVID, perhaps in some of these kids. At the moment, there doesn't seem to be good evidence that vaccination actually stops the circulation of the virus. And that's why my own view is that you should concentrate the vaccine on people who are most at risk as a result of it, the people in the groups that I just mentioned.
So that's very interesting. Just picking up on what you're saying there, it sounds to me, if you were the father of a 5, 6 or 7-year-old, that you wouldn't be rushing to get them vaccinated.
I would be thinking about it rather carefully.
I think we'll euphemistically leave it there. I'm so grateful that you've given your time to Times Radio today. Thank you so much to Dr. David Nabarro.
Thank you.